just that moment during praise and worship, I feel closer to God. I've always loved music, and during worship, I'm not sure how to explain it. It's like you open up a barrier.
Depending on what type of worship it is, it always comes at the right time for the right reasons.
In our church, I'd have to take my hat off to the choir and the music ministry. There are many times when I've been moved to tears by the beauty of the soloist's voice, the beauty of the musicians' instruments. And I'm half Norwegian. Crying does not come naturally to me. And the church music ministry here is just superb.
Worship is just an expression of love. Worship is just your outward expression of how you feel about the Lord, how you feel about Jesus, how he makes you feel.
Really reflecting on, the things that God has done for me, just being within his favor in certain aspects of my life, and reminding me of that really shapes and molds my heart.
You just feel a closeness that you don't usually feel, like maybe when you read the Bible or pray. It rejuvenates me. It's like a kickstart for the week. It's different for me. I think worship does it for me.
God uses moments of worship to impact me through anything, song, depending on the words of the song, depending on the beat of the song. Especially when you walk in the sanctuary and then that praise and worship song is on, and no matter what you was going through that week, that song was just like the perfect song for you.
I wish everybody could attend this church. This church is wonderful, just wonderful. The people here are marvelous. We've been here now about 6 years, and every Sunday it's the same feeling.
Feel good when you worship. Sometimes you're going through something and you feel pain, so you cry. And there's nothing else you can do but cry, but it's still a form of worship.
There's times when I fall short and miss the mark, but really knowing that I can always go back and maintain that connection and that relationship with Christ has really gone a long way in shaping my heart.
Welcome back to session 2 of this series on worship. I trust that you were watching this past week to note some of your thoughts and responses in the context of worship. This time, I want to talk with you briefly about how and why we worship. If you're familiar with several churches or have recently gone through a change in worship style in your church, you're probably aware how strongly people can feel about a certain way of worship. Those who have grown up with worship bands have no idea of the battles that went on in churches when the assumption was that unless there was an organ or at least piano music, worship couldn't happen. Your worship background may involve a weekly, almost identical experience of liturgy that was either deeply meaningful for you and drew you into God's presence, or a meaningless and rote repetition that allowed you to think about other things. You might be familiar with the new and different as the Spirit moves approach to worship every week that made coming to worship with anticipation something that made you wonder, what's God going to do? But for others, that same approach can somehow get repetitious and may have seemed casual and light instead of awe-inspiring and earth-shaking worship. The point is that two people attending the same worship service in whatever style may have profoundly different experiences. One may feel God was right there, while just down the aisle, another feels like God must be everywhere but there. I hope you will realize that even in your small group, God has graciously met you in some very different worship settings. For each of us, those encounters with God tend to make us feel that those particular settings are real worship and anything else isn't. One of the best examples of this is the account in the Gospels of the transfiguration of Jesus in Matthew chapter 17. Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on a mountain, and there his glory was revealed to them as he talked with Moses and Elijah. Can you imagine that scene and that moment? But here's the amazing thing. As soon as it happened and they picked themselves up off the ground, Peter had a brilliant idea. Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. Now, I don't think he wanted to open a tourist stop. I think he wanted to create a permanent worship space there. He wanted to turn that amazing moment into a monument. We all do that, trying to turn our experiences into something permanent. But notice, Acts chapter 7, verse 48 says, however, the Most High does not live in houses made by human hands. You see, God isn't confined to our building structures or even our particular worship structures or styles. And God isn't stuck or limited to what may have been very meaningful encounters in spirit and in truth in the past. Psalm 22, verse 3 tells us that God is enthroned or dwells in the praises of his people. That means that God isn't as concerned with format as he is with heartfelt response from us. We're fortunate to have God's word and 2,000 years of praise and worship songs, thousands of written prayers, and every day the collection grows as people like you and I approach the one true God in worship. It is important and valuable to talk about how we worship, but at the end of the day, what really matters is that we actually worship the one supremely worthy of our worship. Which brings us briefly to another issue. Alongside this matter of how we worship is the often unspoken question about why we worship. When people have been honest with me over the years, they've often admitted some doubts about the importance of worship in the life of a follower of Jesus. And here's their thinking. If God is all sufficient and completely content with who he is, why on earth does he need our worship? What good does it do him? And if God does need our worship to affirm his divinity, then he is a God with a weakness and not really God. So which is it? These are instinctive questions, but they have a huge flaw in what they assume. They take it for granted that God is fundamentally like us. If we were all sufficient and had no need or use for the worship of people we created, we wouldn't insist they worship us. If we needed their worship to affirm our divinity, we would be ashamed to be so needy and would just as soon they didn't worship us. All of that confusion would be us. It isn't the way God functions. So why, if God doesn't need our worship, do we need to worship? The answer is because we need to worship. We were made to worship, and we always worship. If we don't worship the one worthy of our worship, we worship someone other than God, either ourselves, an object that we declare to be divine, or someone we can consider divine who is not God. When the great leader Joshua was coming to the end of his career as a successor of Moses in leading the people of Israel, he put the human choice clearly before his people. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, he said, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So no, God doesn't need our worship, but we haven't fulfilled our purpose if we don't worship. Worship gives us those moments when we can taste heaven, our eternal home. Again, may God bless you as you share with each other and your discoveries and experiences in God's presence.